Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Hunt, the Director of Education and Public Programs here at MoCA, and I am thrilled to welcome Elena Shtromberg to our galleries this evening for a bit of a walking tour of Anna Maria Maiolino. But first, a quick introduction of our guest. Elena Shtromberg is Associate Professor of Art and Art History at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Her work as an art historian has been mainly to expose larger audiences to art being produced in Latin America, and more specifically within Brazil, during a historically, socio-politically significant chapter. Most recently, Shtromberg co-curated a fantastic show featuring over 60 works of video art entitled Video Art in Latin America, alongside curator Glenn Phillips, head of Modern and Contemporary Collections at the Getty Research Institute. Their show is on view at LAX Art, and I highly recommend you go see it at some point so that you have a deeper appreciation of Elena's practice and long research. She and Glenn Phillips have been working together since 2012 to cull through so much material that our audiences in Los Angeles are just getting to experience for the first time in many ways. Shtromberg has received research and travel awards from institutions such as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Center for Latin American Studies, UCLA, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Her 2016 publication, Art Systems, Brazil and the 1970s, was deemed, quote, a novel approach to the study of Brazilian conceptual art during the 1970s, the most repressive period of military rule. Because of her incredible insights into the era, movement, and subjects, we are thrilled to have her here tonight to speak more about Anna Maria Maiolino's practice in the context of her first U.S. survey exhibition, as well as in the larger context of Pacific Standard Time, LA. Please join me in welcoming her to MoCA tonight.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you all for braving the traffic and the closure of Grand to make it here. I'm so excited to be able to share a little bit of my insights into Anna Maria's work. I have followed her and known about her for a long time, and I'm thrilled to finally see her in a U.S. institution, and no less MoCA. So I thought we could kind of start inside the galleries, just so we're positioned where her work is, and we can have a little bit of more access to her practice. And that way you're looking at art and not me. Her practice comprises a lot of different media and a lot of different kind of thematic strands, and it's a little bit difficult to categorize her easily, so sometimes she doesn't make it into the survey books or the books about Brazilian art, for example. But she's definitely grounded and a part of the canon of what is Brazilian art. So first I wanted to kind of tell you a little bit about her for those of you who don't know. She was born actually in Italy, so she's not Brazilian. And she moved to Venezuela when she was 14 or 12, actually 12. And then she moved to Rio when she was 18. And so from my perspective, she kind of forms her artistic sensibility while she's in Rio. And it's a very fervent time in Brazil. It's an exciting time. She moves there in 1960. How many people have been to Brazil? Okay. Have you been to Brasilia? Because Brasilia is inaugurated, the capital city, the new kind of very fancy capital city is inaugurated in 1960, and that's the year that she moves there. So it's a very optimistic moment in Brazilian life and kind of social life, except that that moment is quickly thwarted in 1964 with a military coup. And a lot of people say that Brasilia cost so much to make that it created a lot of deficiencies economically, and that created the conditions for the coup because there was a lot of economic losses. So that's a little bit the context. She starts going to a school where she learns engraving. And she goes to the School of Fine Arts, which is one of the few places where you can study art in Rio at this time. There aren't, what we would think of as art schools today. Those happened a little bit later in the 1970s. And there she meets a lot of the artists that are sort of the more better-known figures. She also meets Rubens Gershman. I don't know how many people have heard of him, but he's, I would say, a quite well-known figure. He's often shown within the rubric of pop art. And you'll see some of those influences in Anna Maria's work. So you can see that she has this very long trajectory. She starts in Italy, she moves to Venezuela. She was actually born to an Ecuadorian mom, so she spoke Spanish. And then she moves to Brazil and has to learn Portuguese. And to me, that situation of kind of constantly migrating and moving around creates a sensibility of an outlier, right? Someone who is both on the outside and the inside. And that ability to move in and out of things is a thread that I see throughout all of her work. So as we look at kind of different pieces, the inside and the outside, you'll see it plays a really important role in how she conceives of her works, even if they're ceramic or paper or made out of three-dimensional materials. But one of the things that I want to mention before we actually look at work, and I promise we will, is that she comes to her artistic self in this moment in Brazil known with this exhibit and a kind of manifesto that's known as New Objectivity. New Objectivity is an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio in 1967, and Elio Oiticica, who might be an artist that you are familiar with, he just has had a show close at the Whitney in New York, creates a manifesto or this text about what he considers to be the Brazilian avant-garde. And one of the things that he says is to move away from easel painting, right, toward objects. And so there's this kind of interest in creating objects, right? And maybe taking away a little bit of what we see as just the contemplative mode of looking at art, that is, we just look at it and reflect on it, to something that's a little bit more physical that we encounter with our bodies. And that, I think, very much permeates her work, that those ideas that are part of this Brazilian avant-garde. And one of the other things that he talks about is making art that has a political or kind of a social commitment, right? Having, including a social critique, something that does reflect on and comment on the particular social period. And we'll see that in some of her works. So let's start with this, with these works here. So like I said, when she started her interest in the arts, she was quite young, about 19. She went to study with an engraver. One of them was quite famous, Geldi. And so the earlier works are mostly print, right? Because she was working with print. And that interest in print, I think, carries over even when she's making, the ceramic work, because there's a sort of interest in seriality that we can see, I think, originates in the print work. But one of the things that we can see is an interest in ingestion and digestion. And again, I relate that to this kind of inside and outside, right, that I was mentioning. So you could see this in print form here, and then there's this sort of object form here. Or, people have included this in shows about pop art. It's called Glue, 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 which is funny. I mean, it's meant to be funny. And it's, of course, this process of digestion. And her mouth is open and things are going in. And people have read this work and this kind of series as a reflection on the ideas behind anthropophagy. Anthropophagy was an idea that Oswald de Andrade in 1928 wrote about. This was a famous Brazilian writer, also married to a very well-known Brazilian artist, Tarsila do Amaral, and he talked about Brazilian culture and Brazilian art as the product of all of these influences that you ingest, digest, and then you secrete something that will be entirely unique and different, right? So it was a way to think about artistic influence. And so this moment when she's making these works, I think she's definitely influenced by the ideas of anthropophagy. That is, things go in, they're processed, and they create something that's unique and different. And this work, this sort of, three-dimensional kind of object work, is in line with the kinds of ideas that were promoted in New Objectivity, that exhibit that I told you about in 1967. It kind of aesthetically looks like the other works in that exhibit. And I'll show you this other work. That, from my perspective, also has a relationship to New Objectivity. But it also kind of brings up another concern that one can think about vis-a-vis her work, which is the feminine condition, right? The condition of being a woman artist. So, of course, we have, again, this three-dimensional object. We even have, some of the children's clothes that are hanging on this line. And it's a window. It's called waiting, right? And someone is looking out. And there's this kind of interest in public life that is looking out, and the domestic or private life that is what you see when you're in there. And like I said, that interest of out and in that we're going to continue to see in her work is something that, to me, is very relevant here. But of course, we can also think about, the chores of a woman, right? The sort of washing and the hanging of the clothes. One of the things I wanted to mention was, how many people have gone to Radical Women and seen, because Anna Maria Maiolino also has works in that exhibit, which is an exhibit about women artists in Latin America. It's at the Hammer Museum. And in that exhibit, you see a lot of women who deal with the kind of domestic condition as their artwork, right? And one of the things about Brazil is there actually was a very strong presence of women artists since the beginning of the 20th century. So unlike other countries where women had to sort of fight to assert themselves, in Brazil that was quite different. One of the leading figures of Brazilian modern art was Anita Malfatti, who in 1916 and 18 was already showing artworks that would galvanize the artistic community to sort of follow in her footsteps and work on new and experimental modes of art making. After Anita, there's so many other women. There's Tarsila do Amaral, there's Lígia Clark and Lígia Papi, her contemporaries, Anabela Geiger, Sonia Andrade, Letícia Parente. So there are so many women artists. So for me, when I've talked to a lot of the women artists in Brazil, and I interviewed quite a few for my book, many of them were really uncomfortable with the idea of making feminist art, or at least they didn't really identify with feminism. However, they did identify with the feminine condition, right, and kind of the domestic chores that a woman would have to undertake even as an artist. So this is something that I think, Anna Maria does in a really interesting and unique way. She brings her family and she brings her kind of domestic chores into her work, but not necessarily as a critique of, masculinity or the kinds of tenets we see in U.S. feminism. It's a little bit more subtle, such as a work like this, right? The woman is waiting. There's a sense of ennui or a kind of, she's waiting for something to happen, right? And yet the work of waiting, she turns this ennui into an artwork. And so that is really creative and unique, and something that we can think about is, especially kind of clever and unique to Maiolino's vision of this kind of feminine condition. So now I want to take you into this room, and then we'll come back around and look at some of the more graphic work. So in this room, you'll see that there are a lot of works that deal with the political context in Brazil. So I mentioned to you that there was a military coup in 1964. Now, by 1967, things start getting a little hairy for artists. And when they first had the coup, the military pretty much left the artists alone. They weren't the target. The target were the union leaders, people who had labor disputes, et cetera. The artists were not so targeted, partially because the audience for art was not that big, right? So it wouldn't affect millions of people. But by 1967, the military regime gets a little bit stricter, and there's a significant rise in censorship art exhibits become visited, and art exhibits, the first art exhibit that kind of publicly closes down is in 1968. And that is when Anna Maria leaves, right? She leaves with her then husband, Rubens Gershman, and they go to New York in a kind of self-exile. And a lot of famous Brazilian artists left at this time. It wasn't just Anna Maria Maiolino and Rubens, but Elio Oiticica was in New York at this time. There was an Uruguayan artist, Louis Kamnitzer. A lot of South American countries at this time were undergoing a military dictatorship, and New York was a kind of hub for those artists. So in this room, we can see a little bit how that critique of the dictatorship is very present in her work. And remember, she's coming from that period of new objectivity where Oiticica was saying we should include the political and the social critique in the way that we formulate the artworks, right? That would make our avant-garde different from the avant-garde of New York, right, or Paris, right? This is going to be a reflection of our situation. So I think that the piece where you sort of very obviously see that critique is in this work here. So this is O Herói, or the hero. And of course, it's a military figure, right, that's positioned as a hero, but then, you know, has a skull and speaks to a kind of death, right? There's this idea that a sort of threat, right, that the uniform is posing. And I think that that threat is carried out in a work like this, which is slightly later from '74, but she has this series called Photo Poem Action is how they translated it. And what you see is a series of photos where she is, you know, cutting out her tongue, cutting her nose, you know, injuring herself, and putting her body at risk, right? And so she's speaking to the risks of the body in the military dictatorship, which at this point, you know, people are getting disappeared, bodies get disappeared. So there's a constant threat to your body when you're living in this authoritarian regime. And I think that that's something she's reflecting on, because you can't speak out, right? There isn't a freedom to speak out. And so when she's cutting off her tongue, it's you know, not directly saying this is a critique of the military dictatorship, but one could read that easily, right? Because of the inability to speak and to express yourself in the way you want to, right? So that's that work. And then if we look in back, I think that this map also, and I'm just trying to show you different kinds of work so you get the breadth of the different media that she used and the different kinds of ideas that she incorporates, which is, you know, very unique to her practice. This is called The Geographic Situation. It's from 1976. So she, like I said, she went to New York in 1968, but she returns to Brazil in 1971. She actually leaves her famous artist husband, Rubens Gershman, and moves back to Rio and starts making art again. When she was with him in New York, she had 2 kids, and so she didn't really have time to make that much work, but she was a part of a very kind of animated art community, which included a lot of the Latin Americans living in New York, escaping their own authoritarian regimes. And that community was very active, and Louis Kamnitzer, one of the kind of well-known members of that, the self-exiled community from Uruguay, met her, saw her work, and suggested that she join Pratt University to take some graphic workshops. So she did. One of the things about Anna Maria Maiolino is she doesn't stay put in any kind of institution for long. So she weaves in and out. Remember, we talked about how her outlier situation, I think that that's also the case in how she feels in art school. She'll go and she'll sort of take in and absorb, right? What if we go back to that idea of anthropophagy, she'll absorb some of the things that she sees, but then what she sort of expels will be uniquely her own. So she's coming out of this moment, like I said, in New York, where she has experienced all of these people fleeing their country. And so here, this kind of black soul of Latin America is, of course, a reference to the black situation that Brazil was, facing. But not only Brazil at this time, it was Brazil and Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Peru, right? So it was very prominent in South America, and it's very stark and black. There's little hope here, right? And that is the situation that she finds herself in. And this really reminds me of a video work. And of course, Amanda was telling you that I work on video, but there's a work by Anna Bella Geiger. And to me, Anna Maria Maiolino and Annabella Geiger have a lot in common. I think that, I don't know if people know Annabella Geiger, but I think that they share this outlier status where they kind of work with different media and across different themes. But Annabella, at this time, exactly this time, makes a video where she draws a map and then blacks out Brazil. And this is something that, actually, that video is part of my exhibit, so I'm telling you in case you go, you could see it. But it's, that sort of black lack of hope that people living in this situation are facing is shared among the two. Now, there are other, works in this room that are really interesting. She, like I told you, she was sort of interested in bringing her family in and kind of her domestic life. And in this photograph, and she calls this the photo poem action series. And so combining, right, these different media, this is her mother, herself, and her daughter, right? And sort of tracing a very feminine lineage in or through the art, right? So using the artwork to position this kind of very, feminine-based ancestry and linking it to the future, I think says a lot about the kinds of ways that she approaches feminism, right, and gender questions. I want to show you this work. I don't know how many people saw it or came to the reenactment of it here. I've always been really fascinated by it, and I've been fascinated by the role of eggs in Brazilian art, and probably would take me too long to explain. But there are two works here that, actually, there's the photo series, there's the film. In the 1970s, Anna Maria Maiolino used Super 8 to make a series of films that, from my perspective, are some of the best films from that period. But this was a performance, and this is documentation of a performance called Between Lives, and this is with eggs. And in it, she places eggs on the street, and then she walks through them. And of course, what you get is the sort of the threat that you'll step on one and break it. So there's, you're invoking that vulnerability of a living thing, the egg. On the other hand, the egg is something that gives life, right? It's something that produces life. It's organic. And so there's this kind of interesting and maybe productive tension between something that produces life, but something that's so fragile, right, and so delicate. And I think that this is also, in some ways, a reflection of the moment she's living in, right, where bodies, I told you, are threatened, where there's a kind of vulnerability to the physical body. And an egg, or the egg, she uses in different formats. For example, here, you see a kind of a game. It's called plus, minus equals minus. And so you have two people that are rolling an egg to each other, and the goal is not to break it, right? The funny thing is, one of the players, I think this is Claudio Tassi, I can't recognize him, but the other one is Paulo Herkenhoff, who is a famous curator now, and has, been the director of several museums in Rio. But this is when he was very young and still an artist. And I'm surprised he let her show them, because he doesn't like to show works that show him as an artist. He likes, to be thought of primarily as a curator. He's written beautiful texts, and he's written a really beautiful text about Anna Maria Maiolino's work, if you're interested in kind of further study. But there he is. Now he looks very different, but he has the glasses that always, there's a look to him that you can always tell it's him. But one of the things I wanted to mention with regard to the eggs is they're all different and yet all look the same, right? And so this is when we start kind of getting into this idea of seriality in her work. I think that that's a theme that we can trace, certainly when we get to the ceramics, but also in a lot of her paper works, right? That there are a lot of these objects that, while they look the same, they are all kind of different and have different characteristics. And so to me, this work and her interest in eggs also has to do with concrete art, and I'll explain a little bit. How many people have seen the Making Art Concrete show at the Getty? So this is, if you're interested in concrete art has a lot to do with geometric abstraction. And geometric abstraction is artworks that are completely linear, right? That completely rely on geometric shapes as the basis and the content of the artwork. That is, there's no reference to life. Now, that was a very dominant mode of creating art during the 1950s. 1960s, when Anna Maria Maiolino comes, the artists are still interested in that kind of geometric foundation or that basis, but now they're interested in reintroducing life, right? The organic into that kind of geometric fold. And so the egg is this kind of perfect spherical form, right? And yet it has this capacity to produce life. So several artists at this time work with an egg, and one of the artists is Ligia Papi, who you could see in Radical Women. She has a performance where she breaks out of a kind of square. Right? It's as if she were being born, right? And so it's this kind of paper square that she's created on a beach, and that piece is called The Egg, and that was sort of around the same time, or a few years earlier. But to me, that interest in incorporating these geometric forms that have an organic basis is something that we're going to see, and something that she repeats in her ceramic work. Anna Maria Maiolino was also married to a very well-known artist, Victor Grippo. I don't know if people know him from Argentina. He was works with conceptual art. So for a few years, she was married to him in the 80s, and also stopped making work. So there were these kind of periods of intense production and periods of lower production. In this room, she has, a series of objects made out of uncooked clay, right? And so we can return to some of the ideas that we've looked at before, which is this kind of interest in seriality, right? And these kind of linear or geometric forms, except that these are all handmade, right? And in one of the texts about her says that her ceramic work is influenced by indigenous artists living in the Amazon, right? Their ways and methods of working with clay and pottery. And it's a little bit hard. I don't know enough to say if that's true. I think it's an interesting supposition. But, if we think about these works, again, these are all handmade. So they all look the same, and yet each one is different, right? Because they're handmade. So she, from what I understand, every piece was, imprinted by the finger of her or the assistants that were working in this room, and then hung on the wall. And I don't know if you guys see this, but if you come, in the back and look at this, to me this looks like a kind of map. And this is another theme that I identify in her work, is a kind of mapping impulse, right? The desire to create a kind of topography out of different pieces. So even with the egg kind of performance, that creates a different kind of urban topography. And in this case, this is a way to map the institution, but also her own work in the institution. And when we go to her works on paper, I think you can also identify that mapping impulse. I think that that's there. And it's something I've been attuned to. It's, something that I've written about, that kind of mapping impulse during the 1970s. For example, in the 1970s, they started using satellite technology to map different areas of the Amazon. And to me, that brought a different understanding of space, right? How space is used. And I think that in some ways translates into a desire on the part of artists to create, different types of cartographies. So, there are a lot of different things we could say about the work here. Of course, I brought my son here, and he immediately thought of pasta, and I think one could easily think about, the domestic condition, making food. She comes from an Italian family, a large Italian family, where certainly making pasta was something that was part of their meal making, and that's something that you could see. I mean, each one of these reflects on that kind of the cooking or the culinary tradition. But I also think that it's that part of that seriality where every piece has some unique characteristic, something different, but in its repetition, it creates something geometric and linear. Right? So I just, was telling you guys about the mapping impulse. And the first work we see in this room is from the series Mental Maps. Right? So kind of trying to situate a mental state on paper. And so you can see that she starts with A, B, C, D, and sort of works her way to M. And of course the A, the Anna, and the M, Maiolino. So she's thinking about herself. I mean, in some ways we can think about this as a self-portrait. Right? It's a self-portrait where she's mapping herself through artistic kind of the materials that are available to her. In 1972, she had just come back from New York, right? So she's in Rio and quite active again, actively working. I told you that she had taken some workshops at Pratt, looking at graphic work. She also was influenced, I think, a little bit by the artist Liliana Porter. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of her. She's an Argentinian artist whose work you can, again, see at Radical Women. So one of the great things about PST that this show is a part of is that we can learn about one artist, but then we can start creating links. And by going to the other exhibits, we can start seeing, okay, this is related to this. And I think that is one of the, I mean, maybe a once-in-a-lifetime situation, but having 70 shows of artists working in similar periods and from, different geographic contexts that are proximal, you start kind of seeing patterns. And that is really, I think, fun. So I think you can take what you get here and take it to Radical Women or take it to the video show or other places and start making connections. And in some ways, that's what she did as an artist, right? She traveled, she made connections, and then created her own work. And if we look at the series here in general, and I think this is a beautifully hung room, it has all of these different works. And one of the things that she's interested in that you'll find are these holes. Now, we saw this kind of, this sort of excavated hole in that glue, right? The mouth as an orifice. And I think that we can connect the two and think about this hole as a kind of orifice. She has this kind of constant interest in holes because I think they point to the inside and the outside, right, that we began talking about, which is about this interior and exterior, right? If we think about that window, it's a window onto the exterior world, but also a window into kind of her interior life. And, one of the things that people who write about, political situations that are authoritarian say is in those situations, the private, the interior becomes political because in public spaces, you're very limited with what you can do and say. And so you kind of turn in. And in Anna Maria's work, we see this kind of turning in different ways. So through a kind of material and artistic gesture. So this is, and then the other thing I wanted to mention was these are called drawing objects. Now remember that after new objectivity, artists are interested in this idea of object, right? So you maybe hadn't thought about drawing as creating objects, right? You thought about it as creating something two-dimensional that would be hung on a wall. But she thinks of these as objects that you encounter in a physical way, right? You're not just looking at it, but you're also looking in, right? And you're trying to see what's inside. And that creates this sort of three-dimensionality that artists are really pursuing through this new objectivity, and that I think even through drawing, she's able to bring in, right? So, I mean, go ahead and look around. These are all, they all have some kind of orifice or some kind of hole that allows you to interact with it in a unique way. I mean, it could be. I mean, if one could think about it today, yeah, I mean, these were made in the 70s, but yeah, I mean, it's... Right, I mean, right, I think that's a really great connection to, today's world where a lot of artists are using 3D printers to create objects. So we're translating that kind of two-dimensionality into a three-dimensional space. She was doing that really early on with her drawings. And, from my perspective, this is some of the most creative drawing work that I've seen. I think that it is really unique. I think that she also uses thread a lot to kind of connect the inside and the outside, right? So that's another kind of facet of her work that she's constantly looking to put those two sides together in some kind of conversation. But then we can also go back to the domestic condition, right? Sewing, right? And thinking about the feminine condition, using, making clothes, sewing, mending things. And, some of these pieces end up, so for example, if we look at this drawing, we see that grid, right? I talked about the geometric abstraction. In geometric abstraction, a lot of it was based on this very basic grid model, right? And that's a very important model for modernism, this grid. But she takes it apart. She takes the grid apart, right? She doesn't just adapt the grid. She deconstructs it. And you can see that in a lot of the works. The grid starts taking on a different shape. If we look at that piece on the right, then the lines of the grid have kind of come apart and created their own structure, right? So they're moving away from the grid. She's moving away from the grid, just like a lot of the artists working in new objectivity wanted to move away from the dominance of the linearity of geometric abstraction. When I first encountered Maiolino's work, I saw the films, and we haven't looked at the films, and we should look at a few of them. And so that was what I knew by her. And then when I got to Brazil, I went to a museum and saw the ceramic work, and I thought, is that the same artist? I couldn't believe it. But then when you kind of start thinking about it and putting it into perspective, then you see that while the work looks different, the driving forces are, you could identify them as similar. Her handprint, using the hand. That's right, yeah. Okay, so let's walk over, and since I mentioned the films, I want to show you this one film that's very well known by her. I mean, in Brazil, it's the film that's maybe the best known. Now, I think this film is fascinating. It's called In and Out. We've already talked about her interest in interior, exterior, so you can identify that as a really important kind of impulse here. But you see anthropophagy, right? And we talked about anthropophagy. Remember that idea that was put forward in 1928 by Oswald de Andrade, that you ingest and then you secrete something different. And that was a kind of metaphor for artistic production from Brazil, in the sense that there are all these influences in Brazil. There's the African influence, right? There's the indigenous people's influence, and the Europeans who came over, the influence from there. There are French artists who built a school in Rio in the 19th century. So there's a very strong French influence. And one of the things that Brazilian artists wanted to do was not just imitate those influences, right? They're not creating imitations of what is going on in France or anywhere else, but they're using that influence to create something new and unique, right? Something, it's a way to think about influence that isn't just about creating something derivative, And this was something that Oiticica, when he wrote New Objectivity, he didn't want to call what was going on in the 60s in Brazil as avant-garde, because he felt that avant-garde would be imitational, right? It would imitate the kinds of avant-gardes that had gone on in Europe and in New York. So he called it New Objectivity to kind of focus on the unique Brazilian circumstances of creating art. But here you see, this very interesting relationship of duos. I mean, you not only have the opposition of in and out, but you have a male and female mouth, right? And there are things going in and things coming out, right? And so that interest in digestion that we saw in Glue, 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 I mean, we absolutely see it here, reflected on through the medium of Super 8 or film. Right? So, I mean, there's a kind of direct lineage from that piece, from the print, glue, 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 to that kind of object piece, the sort of more pop art piece, and then this, that concentrates on modes of digestion. Now, some people have talked about this work and the idea that there's a very strong and kind of close-up on the mouth as the idea of surveillance. Right? Because everyone was living under surveillance, this very close, intimate look at someone's body and their face and this sort of intimate part of your body is an intrusion, right? And in this intrusion, that is a form of surveillance. So I'm just telling you, that's not something that, I think is the definitive reading of this work, but it is one that some scholars have mentioned vis-a-vis her work. And in a lot of her film work, and you'll see in that piece too, it's a very strong close-up right on the face. And it's something that, one could do with Super 8, of course, but also one could think about in this particular time period. Okay, let's move to kind of my last area. Oh, and did anyone have any questions? I'm sorry, I haven't asked you all along. Yeah. Do you know how they were originally displayed, the films? So Super 8 films were usually displayed, so at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, they had a cinemateca, and oftentimes they were displayed there. There was also, a really kind of famous show called Expo Projeção, and they could, they would be included in film in museums that looked at new media or media in general. At the time, for example, they showed slide work. In 1973, there wasn't really a use of video yet. But they looked at slide work and Super 8. So kind of in those formats, there wasn't a huge audience for them, but in Rio they did have the Cinemateca where they could show that work. One other piece from this room that's also a well-known work from her is this rice and beans. And rice and beans comprise, a really large part of the Brazilian diet. Even if you go today, this is something you'll have for lunch every day with some kind of meat and possibly some vegetables. But this you'll have all the time, and it's amazing. It's the best thing to have. But here. It looks ominous, right? I mean, it's wrapped in a veil, which we kind of, it's displayed on top of a veil, which we associate with mourning. And of course, it's called Monument to Hunger. Now, during the 1970s, there was, there was this sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, there was economic prosperity in Brazil. So there was a lot of, the economy was doing well, but there was also very high inflation, which made it very difficult for poor people to get food. And so, and that would be across the board. And under dictatorships, the people who suffer the most are the poor people. So, these things that are so common and so important to Brazilian diet were off limits, right? And so we can look at them, but we don't have access to them. Okay, and please stop me if you have a question. I'm very happy to discuss any work that you find interesting or want to know more about. I have this sort of mental map of what I want to cover, and that may not be what you want to cover, so I'm happy to oblige you. So we'll go into the last room that I'm going to talk about. Everyone don't touch anything, but don't you want to? I mean, there's something about it that makes you want to interact with it. And I think, to me, that's part of that legacy of creating objects that one interacts with, right? That aren't just about kind of looking or, contemplative reflection. It really is about, you look at this and you think, wow, this, reminds me of 1,000 things that this might remind you of, right? And so you want to have this kind of, some kind of personal interaction with it. So a lot of these works are from the 1990s. And you can see that, you could see that it looks different from the kinds of works we just saw, but you're going to see the same interests reenacted, which is these are made out of cement, they're molds, right? And there's an inside and an outside. So if we think about those drawing objects that we saw, we can think about this as a cement version of those drawing objects, right? There's a kind of depth to it. We want to look in, and always that inside-outside relationship, right? There's an interior and exterior. There's some kind of, material. While it looks like it comes from a mold, there's all of the individual pieces are different, right? They all have some aspect to it that, while it may look serial or repeated, they're each individual, right? They all have their own individual shapes, individual holes, and this is, again, going back to that geometric language. In some ways, if we're looking at that wall, we see these geometric boxes, right? So very much in line with the kinds of geometric abstract works from the 1950s, except that each of them has, a kind of a depth to it, and underneath that geometry, we find something else, right? We find all of these interesting things to look at and to explore, and not just look at, where we see it and we move on, but we want to try to see it from different angles too, because that's going to give us different experiences. And you're going to have a different experience than my experience, right? I might be particularly drawn to looking up top, but you might be drawn looking to the bottom. And so again, that playfulness, right, is always a part of her work, even from the 1960s. And you see the seriality here. You see the egg return, right? To me, this is the return of the egg in, a different material. This is one, none, and 100,000, right? And it's made out of cement and pigment, but to me it really speaks to that egg series that we've seen before, and that interest, except it's reincarnated in cement form, right? It's thinking about using different materials, but going back to the ideas and concepts that are always present in her work, right? The seriality, but each one is different. Right? And, you can think about that as well with these works on the floor. Now, notice that these are on the floor. They're sculptures, but maybe we're used to seeing sculptures on a pedestal, except that these are in our way. Right? We're forced to walk around them. We're forced to have some kind of physical encounter with them. Even, in other words, you can't just look at this and walk by it. Right? Which is, it's part of that tradition that's going back to the 1960s of creating objects, right? Not creating works that you're just going to, look at, but creating works that you're going to have some kind of encounter with. So thoughts or questions or anything I can, yes? Yeah. Yes, she was. She was, early on. No, so anthropophagy is one theory, but new objectivity had its own theory. It was called the General Scheme of the Vanguard, and it was a text that Oiticica, who was one of the, I would say one of the more well-known artists from new objectivity, because a lot of the works in new objectivity, it was a return to figuration. And by that I mean a return to the human form from the dominance of the geometric abstraction. So a lot of the works were pop art-like, except for Oiticica, who created a whole installation called Tropicalia. I don't know if people have heard of it, and I can talk to those interested about it, but it was this very much interactive installation where one would walk through it, one would smell things, hear things, touch things, and that kind of viewer participation was something that was privileged in Brazilian art at that time. And I think even though, we can't touch this, I think that's an institutional kind of code more than, Anna Maria's code. I think she's tied to that context of creating objects that you're going to have some kind of physical encounter with. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah. But it's very black and white, yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are a few works that are color, the sort of more pop art oriented ones. It, right, and that it privileges different kind of modes. I mean, a lot of there was, in Rio, there was a black and white salon, and so there was a period where artists were working in black and white. So if you look at late 50s work, you'll see a lot of black and white paint. There was also some tariffs on paint, so it was hard to get paint. So, some of it is practical. It's easier to find black and white, but some of it is a choice. It's a starkness, right, that makes you concentrate on, different concepts, right, rather than the color. Yeah. Yeah. So the artist community, I mean, some of them were of European descent, but it was really, there was a very strong community of artists working in geometric abstraction. They were called Grupo Frente, the front group, right? So in the 50s, it was artists like Ligia Clark, Ligia Pap, and Elio Oiticica. They were the famous ones, but there was also Ivan Serpa, Amilcar de Castro, and they were creating work in a very geometric fashion, right? It was, you would see paintings with different geometric forms in some, but it was largely painting. And then there was a kind of strong pushback by those artists against that kind of work. They saw that work as too rational, too mathematical, and they felt that it lacked expression. And they thought, art for centuries has been about expression, so we need to bring expression back to that art. And that's why in the 60s, they were really interested in exploring the body. So they started reading a lot of texts about phenomenology. I don't know if people, know what that is, but it was this kind of how the body structures your experience of the world, right? And so they were reading these very, psychological texts and thinking about how to enact them in their artwork. So that was the art world in Rio in the 1960s. It was very active, animated, very interested in unique experimental forms. They were linking to Sao Paulo, but in a way of rejection, right? They were rejecting what Sao Paulo was doing and trying to do something unique and different. I wanted to point out how these drawings are hung, which is spectacular. But also, we began with kind of these concepts, and then we end with those ideas of mapping, right? And I think that this is, to me, when I look at these, and as someone who's looked at that mapping impulse, I can't help but think about it here, right? But it's a map. So if we think about those satellite technologies that were used in the 1970s to map different regions of the Amazon, here it's such an intimate, delicate, kind of more, a very different kind of mapping process that involves the hand, right? So the sort of opposite of the satellite technology, where you have a panoramic kind of machine-oriented view, this is something that you do through sewing. So we're back to that kind of, the feminine condition and the condition of sewing, but here it's creating these sort of different cartographies of herself, right? And I think it's really, we can see again this interest in shapes that repeat themselves. Now these are from 2001, but I think we can, create a lot of comparisons with the works on paper that we saw in the mental maps series, right, when we looked at those. You have the kind of grid linearity that we talked about. Remember we talked about the grid? But it's undone. It's coming undone, right? It's becoming deconstructed, and it's getting deconstructed through the artist's hand. So we have that incorporation of the physical body, right, the artist's hand, undoing that linearity that was so dominant. So that's, I'm going to end it there. I've really enjoyed this. I hope I have helped in some way. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for coming out. Thanks.